Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me today for another presentation as part of the GreyLearning webinar series, once again sponsored by Tamron. So right off the bat, I want to thank Tamron USA for sponsoring today's webinar presentation and of course all of the presentations that are a part of the GreyLearning webinar series. And today is a little bit of a unique presentation because we're actually addressing questions from you, from the photographers who are joining today. Many of you, thank you very much, submitted your questions in advance so we could try to get those organized as best we could. And I can assure you that we have, I'm sure, more questions than we could possibly address in just a 1-hour webinar, but I will get through as many of those as I possibly can here today. And if you've got questions along the way, feel free to post those into the questions field there as part of the webinar, and we'll try to address as many of those as we can as well. And in looking at some of the questions that came up, certainly there were a couple recurring themes, to be sure. We'll address that as time moves on, but also making sure that we're trying to cover a variety of different topics. So we'll sort of bounce around here just a little bit, but I want to start with a question that actually is a very common issue that photographers have been running into when it comes to dealing with multiple catalogs, I guess in a general sense, but more specifically catalogs on different computers when traveling. And so I'm sure many of you have the scenario where you're using a desktop computer at home, then you go on a trip for photography and you bring a laptop with you and you're using that laptop to actually work with your images while you download your photos and maybe assign star ratings, keywords, etc. And so our first question today asks if there's any way to transfer files from one computer to another with the history steps still listed in the history pane. When traveling, he's using his laptop to go through the images and sometimes makes adjustments, but when they are transferring to the computer, the history is being lost. So in the develop module, of course, as many of you are aware, there is a history available, and so if I get to the history here, you can see this image was imported, and if I open up the shadows, for example, you'll see that the shadows indication there, the step that was applied, and then if I darken the shadows back down, we'll see that there's another step in the history. And the issue here then is if I am working on a laptop and then I go home and want to re-import those photos into my master catalog, how do I retain that history? Well, the key is to make sure that you are working in Lightroom with the catalog from one computer to the next. So taking your, let's call it our traveling or our laptop catalog and merging it with your master catalog at home. The key here, now in theory, you could save the metadata out to the actual photos. So if we go into our catalog settings, for example, on the Lightroom menu, if you're using Lightroom on a Macintosh, on the edit menu if you're on Windows, we can go into catalog settings, and you all have heard me talk, I'm sure by now, on the metadata tab, this automatically write changes into XMP setting. Well, if we use that option, then most of our metadata will be saved out to the actual image files. However, even with that option enabled, not everything will make it. So you could enable this option and much of the information about your photos, keywords, star ratings, for example, will be preserved. But things like the actual history, membership in collections, virtual copies, that would all be lost if you simply re-import those photos, including the XMP sidecar files, into your master catalog at home. Instead, what you want to do is take that catalog and merge it with your master catalog at home. And so, for example, you might use the option to export as a catalog. Maybe you have, for example, when you're traveling, your catalog plus your photos are all on an external hard drive. You could just connect that external hard drive to your computer at home and import from there. If not, you could certainly select all. So let's say these are all of the photos from my trip. If we assume this was just a traveling catalog, I can select all of those images or even go up to the All Photographs collection in the Catalog section on the left panel in the Library module so that I can make sure I'm selecting all images from the entire catalog. And then once I've selected whichever photos those might be, I can go up to the File menu and choose to export as a catalog. So if I export as a catalog, I'm making a catalog, but I can also turn on this Export Negative Files checkbox. It's a checkbox with a really weird name. I don't know what my negative files are. unless we're pretending like we're back in the days of film. These would be your negative strips as opposed to your original slides. Makes no sense, but I digress. Make sure that checkbox is turned on, because what that checkbox actually means is include your source images along with the actual catalog. So I could save this as a name. Obviously, I would probably put this on an external hard drive, give it a name, and then click the Export Catalog button so that I'm creating a brand new copy of my catalog, my traveling catalog or laptop catalog, along with the photos themselves. And now that's all on an external hard drive, which I can connect to my computer. And then when I'm on my computer, I can go to my master catalog, launch Lightroom with my master catalog open, and choose the option to import from another catalog. And what I would typically do is import from that catalog using the add option, essentially. Leave the photos where they are, just so I get all the information merged and photos wherever they were on the external hard drive. And then I can always drag that folder into the appropriate location. So I generally treat that as two separate steps. You can also copy them to your master storage location if you'd prefer. And this is actually a question that came up in several contexts. Those of you who submitted questions in advance, there was a variety of variations on this theme of essentially, how do I get my photos when I'm traveling on my laptop? How do I get them to my master catalog where I have not just the photos, but all of that information so I can star rate on the go, etc.? And in fact, I've covered this in a couple of places. You might be interested. We're just about to launch an updated version of my real-world workflow course. In the next couple of days, that will be available. It's an update to a course that I'd already created where I walk you through my typical organizational workflow in Lightroom, and I do address this issue there in more detail as well. All right, so moving right along here. Yes. Okay, so we've got a question about transitioning from Aperture. Do you all remember Apple's Aperture? It went by the wayside, and so many photographers who had been using Aperture are now using Lightroom Classic. And in transferring photos from Aperture to Lightroom Classic, it resulted in date-based folders containing folders for years, subfolders for months and days, which is onerous. I would agree with that. And the question is there now a way to combine all of the months and days for each individual year into one yearly folder without all the subfolders for that year? And of course, the answer is yes, you could do that. I don't happen to have a date-based folder set up here that's really set up to show you what that looks like. But if we just pretend, for example, that this Austria folder, which actually contains no photos, let's pretend that that is a year folder, and each of these individual, what are actually year folders, Austria 2012 and Austria 2016, let's pretend that those are these date-based or day-based folders, you might say. So how do I take all of these photos and move them? Well, there's a couple of options that are available. First off, we could select all of the photos, and as a general rule, many of you are aware that I recommend if you're going to select multiple photos, that we do that with the grid view so that if we make changes to metadata, it affects all of those photos. So I could go into the folder, select all, and drag the photos into the destination folder. We're pretending that that would be a year folder versus the day folder. But of course, the problem with that is that you're doing a lot of work with lots and lots of different photos in different folders. And so instead, I would want to actually work with multiple folders all at the same time. And if it were only day folders, then I could just select multiple folders. So I could select the first folder in a list. So for example, the first day of the year, and then hold the Shift key and click on the folder for the last day of the year. And now I'm seeing the images from both of those folders or all of those folders. I could then select all and drag and drop. Another option, which would be a little more clever, I suppose, would be to go into the parent folder, and then we can actually show photos in subfolders. So from the library menu, I can show all of the photos that are in subfolders so that I could select all of those and then actually drag and drop all of the photos. So it's sort of funny here. I'm looking at, it's the Austria folder that we're pretending is a year folder, but I'm actually seeing photos that are in a variety of different subfolders, but I can then select them all and drag and drop into that parent folder. Even though it seems like that's the parent folder that I'm currently looking at, I'm actually seeing what's down in the subfolders. And so in that type of situation where you don't have any photos in the top level folder, you could still access all of the photos down below with that option on the library menu to show photos in subfolders. As a general rule, by the way, just a brief aside, I recommend turning that option off because it can otherwise seem confusing that, oh, I have 63 photos in this folder and then 18 here and 45 here, and you might not realize that those are just totals. 63 is the sum of these other two numbers. And furthermore, you might go into these folders and say, oh, wait, I have the same photos in two different folders, when in fact you do not. You're just seeing them. It looks like they're in two different places, but really I'm just seeing all photos from all subfolders when I look at this particular folder. I think that can be confusing. It has a risk of being confusing, and so I suggest turning that option off. Oh, great question here. So they have two camera bodies, both of the same make and model. Is there a way for Lightroom to identify one from the other? And actually, so the question here suggests there's no serial number. In fact, there is a serial number, and you can access that serial number. Depending on how your metadata display is set up, you could see it over on the right-hand side. But more importantly is filtering. And so if in fact, let's go to all of these images. In the case, maybe these are two different cameras. I'm actually not even sure. But if we go to the library filter bar, you can access that by pressing the / key if it's not visible. It's only available in the grid view, but if you were in the loop view, for example, and you press /, it'll switch you to the grid view with that filter visible. And if we go to the metadata tab, you'll see that sure enough, these photos represent several different cameras. But not only can I filter based on the camera itself, I could also change one of these options to the camera serial number. So clicking on the heading for my columns of filtering under the metadata tab, if you will, then I can set this to camera serial number so that I can see the photos based on the serial number. And so very common, for example, let's say, wedding photographer and you've got a second shooter, but you're both using the exact same camera model. You could use the serial number as a way of filtering those photos instead. And so naturally, of course, we could filter also by the specific type of camera, meaning the model of camera that was used, by the lens that was used, but there is that serial number option as well. Oh, this is getting all excited here. A very important question, and something that I've addressed numerous times, both individually with photographers and in general. So the question is, how do I save an image in Lightroom after opening and working in Adobe Camera Raw from Bridge? So you've gone to Adobe Bridge, you open up an image, it comes up in Camera Raw, you've made changes to the image, now you want that image in Lightroom, or you want the changes in Lightroom. And the answer, tongue-in-cheek, I guess, is you don't use that workflow. So one of the most important lessons that I teach to photographers as it relates to using Lightroom Classic is that once you start using Lightroom, well, any version of Lightroom, I guess I should say, because the same would hold true for Lightroom that used to be called Lightroom CC, that the cloud-based version that Adobe decided to make the naming so confusing for. As soon as you start using Lightroom to manage your photos, everything must be initiated inside of Lightroom. So if you want to make a change to a photo, you make that change in Lightroom. And by the way, Lightroom, the develop module, is actually the exact same thing as Adobe Camera Raw in terms of the adjustments that are available. So whatever you see in Adobe Camera Raw, those adjustments are available in the develop module. The interface obviously looks a little bit different, but as long as you've got the latest version of each, for example, the same options are there. And so I would say that if you're going to be using Lightroom, everything starts in Lightroom. You do not want to use Adobe Bridge. You could certainly browse your photos with Adobe Bridge. In theory, I don't see a really strong reason why you would want to do that. So conceptually, if the photo is already in Lightroom, then you'd have to synchronize the metadata. You basically would have a metadata mismatch if you've made changes outside of Lightroom, but really you just want to make sure that you're doing everything inside of Lightroom. Now, if you made changes in Camera Raw to photos that are not yet in your Lightroom catalog, then you most certainly could import those photos in Lightroom, and the changes you made in Camera Raw will be saved in the XMP sidecar file for your raw capture, and so you would still have that information. So if I made adjustments to a photo outside of Lightroom, those same adjustments are going to be available to me whatever settings I applied those adjustments with outside of Lightroom in Camera Raw, which could have also been done via Photoshop, then that would be available when I import the photo. I'll see the effect. So if I converted in Camera Raw to black and white, for example, just to make an extreme adjustment example, when I import that photo into Lightroom, I'll see it as a black and white version. Oh, that's a great question. How do I enlarge the thumbnails in the toolbar at the bottom of the grid view like what you have on your screen? So there's actually two options here. We have the grid view display itself, and then there's the film strip down below. The film strip size of thumbnails is affected by the height of the film strip. So you can point your mouse at the top edge of the film strip panel and then drag up or down to adjust the size of those thumbnails. The thumbnails in the grid view are adjusted in size by this thumbnails slider, and so I can drag left or right to adjust the size of those thumbnails. If you don't see the thumbnails slider, one of two things. It might be that you just need to hide your left and right panels because you don't have enough room on the toolbar for all of the controls, or you might not have the option for thumbnail size available. So the pop-up, the little downward pointing triangle at the far right of that toolbar, you can click to bring up a menu, and then there's a thumbnail size. So if it was not there at all, for example, I could just click on the pop-up, choose thumbnail size, and it is now on the list. So the question here about the book module. Do you all remember that there is a book module in Lightroom Classic? Yes, indeed. We can create books that you can actually save out as a PDF document, or perhaps more importantly, you can print using Blurb. The Blurb service, blurb.com, for producing printed books is kind of sort of embedded inside of Lightroom, you might say. And so if I go into the book module, and you can see that I have, a page layout that I've been working on, and I have some text about the photo. The question here is, in the book module of Lightroom Classic, how do I select a color for my fonts when I'm annotating a page? And so when I'm working with the text here, you can see that if I go in and select my text, for example, maybe I want to make changes to the actual words, especially here since the text is just text about the photo. But then over on the right panel, you might think you need to go into the text section. That would make perfect sense, except we actually need to go down into the type section where we can adjust the font as well as the color. And if we click on the color, the swatch here to bring up a pop-up, and this maybe is part of the motivation for the question, is, well, but how do I choose a color? It's just black. And you might just abandon ship here and just say, never mind, obviously I can't use a color, it must be only shades of gray. Well, it's a funny thing, the way this control works is initially if you're working with black, all you see is black. But if you make a change to the color, even by choosing one of the color swatches that are like a shade of gray, then you'll see that over on the right side, suddenly I have a color available, and if I increase the saturation, now I see colors that are available, and you can see in the background here that the text is changing in real time as well. And then I know there was also a question that related to synchronization. So I actually have Lightroom set up, and one of the questions that I got that was about sort of the general synchronization. So you're familiar with the synchronization feature. So I can go down and have a collection of images. So here's my water favorites collection, for example. Now Lightroom wants to teach me something. I have my water favorites collection here. And if I switch then to, well, actually I'll just close Lightroom here and bring up my web browser. And there I've gone to lightroom.adobe.com, and you can see here's my water favorites. And so I have a collection that is being synchronized. So with the cloud-based version of Lightroom, all of your photos always are being synchronized. As soon as you import a photo, it's being synchronized to the cloud. In Lightroom Classic, only photos that you add to a collection and that you then enable synchronization for that collection, only those photos will be synchronized. And when they're synchronized, it means that they're available theoretically anywhere. And so here, for example, in my web browser, going to lightroom.adobe.com and signing in, the same thing would be possible with my smartphone, with my tablet. If I use the Lightroom app on my mobile device, I can naturally sign in with my Creative Cloud account, and then similarly have that ability to see these photos. So on my smartphone right now or on my tablet right now, I could see these exact same photos because they're synchronized. But one of the questions that I get somewhat regularly is relating to how do I get my iPhone shots into Lightroom Classic? Well, actually, when you use Lightroom Mobile to take a photo, and this related specifically to the use of the Lightroom mobile app, so the Lightroom app on your smartphone, for example, how do you get photos that you capture inside? Because you can actually use the Lightroom mobile app to take pictures, and one of the advantages is you can capture in DNG. But then where do those photos go? Well, they actually get synchronized. And so if we take a look here, for example, on the left panel in the library module in Lightroom, if I expand the list for this appears like a hard drive, yeah, in terms of storage. Here's my internal hard drive and here's my external hard drive, but I also have Tim Gray's iPhone. So my iPhone essentially has its own status as a storage device. And I can see that I actually have imported photos from that storage device. Well, these are the images that were captured on my phone. And in fact, at this very moment, I've got my iPhone in hand. I've brought up the Lightroom app. I've switched to the camera within the Lightroom app, and I'm going to capture a photo of my keyboard. Probably not the sharp. In fact, it's a little blurry, so you'll have to excuse that. But we should momentarily, we'll see if this works. Hopefully this works. If not, we'll chalk it up to the internet letting me down or what have you. But I can actually capture a photo on my device and it will synchronize to the cloud. So conceptually, I should see that photo of the keyboard appear here at any moment if the technology works the way it's intended to, so that I actually can see those photos. So we'll see if that works in a moment. And if it doesn't, then we'll just chalk it up to don't try this at home and try and demo a cool feature when you're live. But in any event, those photos are now synchronizing from my phone to the cloud, and then in turn synchronizing back down to this folder here, these imported photos from my phone. And so I can actually move them. So these are photos captured in the Palouse, for example. I could select these photos. They're currently stored in a location, I don't even know where they are, wherever Lightroom puts these photos when it's part of the synchronization. Well, I can take those photos and then drag and drop them into the desired location. So put them into my Palouse folder, for example. So I'll confirm by choosing Move, and you'll see there's no photos here. In theory, those pictures that I took with my keyboard should also show up in this location. Obviously, they haven't yet, but hopefully they will. But then I could go into my folder here, and somewhere in here I would find those photos that I just moved into the new location. So that's how we can actually take photos from that were captured in Lightroom on our mobile device and get them into what you might say is our normal workflow. Not the most streamlined approach, obviously. I would love it if you could actually have that as an option where they would go into a specific folder structure back home, so to speak. Except keep in mind that on a mobile device, that version of Lightroom is attempting to work, well, not attempting, is functioning with Lightroom Classic and the cloud version of Lightroom on your computer. So whichever version you're using, you could still use the same Lightroom mobile app for that purpose, so for synchronizing back and forth. All right, let's see here. What have we got? A Roundtrip question. Oh, great question here. Okay, so if you make a round trip between Lightroom and an external editor, so one example of that, for example, would be that you are sending a photo from Lightroom to Photoshop, or maybe you're sending captures that are part of a bracketed set, you're sending them over to Aurora HDR in order to create an HDR image. Are those adjustments then baked in? In other words, are they permanently applied to the image? And the answer is yes. So for example, if I take an image and convert it, let's say, to black and white, so I switch over to the develop module and I convert this image to black and white, that's a non-destructive adjustment. I can switch back to color at any time. If I send this photo to another application, let's say part of the Nik collection, Silver Effects Pro, a great tool for creating black and white interpretations of a photo, that change, the result will be a TIFF file, for example, and that will be baked in, meaning it's a permanent change to the image. And so that version of the image, that copy of the image, could not be converted back to black and white, or back to color, I should say, from black and white. Really good question about collections. And so, well, actually, let me just wrap that thought up real quick. What that means is when I'm working inside of Lightroom, my changes are non-destructive in the sense that I could change them back at any time. In the context of other applications, it's generally baked in. Keep in mind that you could also use layers in Photoshop so that you're now using a non-destructive workflow within Photoshop. But in the context of Lightroom, you would say those are baked in but modifiable. But for other plugins, you don't have that adjustment feature. So in Photoshop, you could use adjustment layers and have a non-destructive workflow still. But with other plugins, if you're sending to other external editors, that would not be the case. Photoshop Elements would fit in that same category, by the way, in terms of having layers available. Okay, so related to collections, getting organized, as I'm sure many of you are aware, well, first off, we can use collections. And so I have my folder structure on my hard drive, but I also have various collections. So here I showed you previously the Water Favorites collection, and you can see the little lightning bolt sort of icon, the synchronization icon indicating that this collection is synchronizing, which means I'm able to see that collection of photos in my web browser using lightroom.adobe.com or on my mobile device, on my smartphone or tablet using the Lightroom app. So those collections are available to me at any time, and I could certainly drag photos from any folder. I could go find a folder and drag and drop photos into any of my collections. Well, we can also add to collections during the import process. And so if I'm importing, I'll go ahead and bring up the import dialog here, and then we have an option to add to collection. So I can turn on the checkbox here and then select a collection that I would like to add these photos to. And the question is, can you add photos to more than one collection? So let's say, for example, you want to have a collection for, I need to review these photos, and you also want to have a collection for, I need to send these to a client, and for some of those photos, you want to add them to multiple collections. Unfortunately, during import, you're not able to actually select multiple collections. You're only able to select a single collection to add the photos to. And the idea, in my mind at least, is that primarily you would be adding to a collection for purposes of synchronization, at least in concept. But unfortunately, it's only one at a time, whereas the same photo could be added to multiple different collections once you're actually inside of Lightroom proper. All right, let's see here. Oh, great question. So I want to start using Lightroom. How can I decide if I want to use Lightroom Classic or Lightroom for the cloud? I think that my first answer to that would be you want Lightroom Classic. I would argue that for my audience, I'm assuming that photographers who are paying attention to me probably have similar workflow requirements and maybe similar thoughts, hopefully agree with much of what I say when it comes to organization, your workflow in Lightroom. And so I would say that Lightroom Classic is the best option. That said, admittedly, some photographers might prefer to use the cloud-based version of Lightroom. So how do you decide? Well, first and foremost is understanding the differences. And the core difference between the two, between Lightroom Classic and Lightroom Cloud, it's really just called Lightroom now. It's not even Lightroom CC anymore, so it's very confusing. If I say Lightroom, I usually really mean Lightroom Classic, but if I forget to include Classic, you might assume it's Lightroom Cloud, and it's a whole big mess. But in any event, Lightroom cloud-based is using the cloud, is using internet-based storage as the primary storage for your photos. Lightroom Classic is using your local storage, meaning your hard drives or your internal hard drive, whatever storage you might be using locally. Which essentially means that with Lightroom Classic, you're controlling the storage and the folder structure. With Lightroom Cloud-based, Lightroom is handling all of that because the primary storage is in the cloud. You just have copies of some or all of your photos on your local computer. I don't like giving up that control. I don't like the idea of giving up that control. And so I would say, in general, I'd much rather use Lightroom Classic. And I don't feel that, for my purposes, Lightroom, the cloud-based version, really provides any benefit that I'm interested in. And furthermore, as an avid photographer, I don't want all of my photos synchronized to the cloud because that's going to take a lot of time. I don't need access to all of my photos on my iPhone, for example, all the time. I want to synchronize just, some favorites, some photos that I might want to share with others, or project-based photos, or whatever the case might be. I'd rather manage all of my storage locally. The catalog I'm using here, of course, is not my real catalog. It's a demo catalog. It's got less than 4,000 photos. My actual catalog has over 400,000 photos in it, and I don't want to have to synchronize all of those to the cloud. Furthermore, when I'm on a trip, I might be capturing hundreds or even thousands of photos on a given trip, sometimes on a given day during a trip, and I'm very often not going to have good high-speed internet access when I'm traveling, and so it might take forever for those photos to synchronize. And in the meantime, my workflow is hampered a little bit depending on what I'm actually trying to accomplish. So I would say first and foremost that if you want to manage storage locally yourself, then Lightroom Classic is your solution. If you want all of your photos available all the time, in theory, you could use Lightroom Cloud-based. You could also synchronize collections of, basically everything. But also keep in mind that Lightroom, the cloud-based version, does not yet have all of the features that are available in Lightroom Classic. So, for example, there's not exactly a map module, but that feature more or less exists. But you don't have the options, the book, slideshow, print, and web modules don't even exist within Lightroom Cloud-based. And so there's still some features that are missing there that I would say is, less than ideal, essentially. So a question related to Lightroom, the cloud-based version, and how it differs from Lightroom Classic. When pictures are uploaded to Lightroom, where are the pictures stored? Are they taking up memory on my computer hard drive? And so this depends a little bit on which version of Lightroom you're using and sort of how you have things configured. So in the context of Lightroom Classic, photos only go to the cloud if they're in a collection that is synchronized. And so, for example, here's my water favorites collection, and I have some images there that, as we saw in the browser, are being synchronized to Lightroom in the cloud. Those photos are not taking up extra space on my internal hard drive. Of course, there are source photos that go along with these. So if I go find a photo in a collection, and then I right-click and go to the folder for that image in the library module, I can find which folder that actually is. This is the image that is taking up space on my hard drive. But in the collection, adding a photo to a collection does not consume additional hard drive space. You're not making a second copy of the photo. And synchronizing to the cloud also does not make an extra copy. Now with Lightroom Cloud-based, there's one minor variation on that, in that by default, you're not keeping all of your photos on your internal hard drive. In other words, all of your photos are getting synchronized to the cloud, and if your hard drive is running low on space, some of the photos can be essentially, I don't want to use the word and scare anyone, but they can be deleted, not by you, but by Lightroom, from your internal hard drive to make space available, because the originals are in the cloud, are stored on Adobe's servers somewhere. And so you could essentially have all of your photos in the cloud and none of them on your computer, at least in theory, and that would work out, perfectly fine. There is an option in Lightroom Cloud-based to keep all those photos on your internal hard drive, so that you always have those photos. And if they're in the cloud and not on your hard drive, in other words, if Lightroom deleted them sort of on your behalf to make space available, if you try to access that photo, it will automatically be downloaded for you. So in concept, it's sort of this seamless availability of photos where they're in the cloud always. Adobe is storing them and backing them up and keeping them safe, we hope. But if you need it at any moment, Lightroom will download it, assuming, of course, that you're connected to the internet. All right, so question about working with photos and keywordings. And so they're a wildlife photographer in this particular example, and they tag their images with the name of the animal, the game lodge, etc. And so wanting to, for example, sort by lion and then unsort to get back to all of the images. And so there's a couple of different options there. I don't probably have too many keywords assigned to these photos in the sample catalog, but let's take a look. I'll use all photographs in this case, just so that I've got more photos to work with in terms of having keywords. And here, for example, I can see that this particular image has keyword Austria, stream, and water. Well, that means I could go to my keyword list and see Austria, for example, with a check mark indicating that that keyword has been added to this photo. And so one of the options that's available here would be to filter the images based on the keyword. Well, I could go directly, now that I'm looking at a piece of metadata, if you see an arrow over to the right of that piece of metadata, so the keyword in this case, that right pointing arrow means go to the photos that have this same metadata. So I'll click that little icon, and I've got a filter that is set based on keyword in this particular example for just Austria. So now I'm only seeing photos that have the Austria keyword assigned to them. You can see that that's happening via, once again, the metadata tab of the library filter that I mentioned earlier, and I could see all of my various keywords. So here's keyword Albuquerque, and I could select that keyword. So I don't have to go to the keyword on the keyword list and click on that right pointing arrow. I could come to the metadata tab of the library filter, click the header, the heading as it were, for one of the columns and change that to keyword, and then choose the applicable keyword. So I could choose basilica, for example, or bird, whatever photos that I might have selected here that I've added keywords to, and I can just go and filter them accordingly. And then, of course, if I want to get back to non-filtering for the images, I could just very quickly choose the none option so that I'm filtering based on no criteria. Or maybe I want to just not filter based on keywords, but I still want to filter based on other things. I could go up to the top of the list and choose all so that I'm able to see all of the photos, photos that contain all keywords. I might still have a filter based on other metadata values, of course, as well. So I might be mixing and matching various metadata, but the point is that I can filter by those keywords and then essentially just turn off the filtering. Oh, good question, except I've actually, oh no, did I switch catalogs? No, I did not. But let's see. No, it never showed up, and I think I know why. I think it relates to an issue that I've got with a version of Lightroom here. And so it did not appear. Oh, I didn't actually read the question, I'm being told. Did my iPhone photo appear on my desktop? And it would appear that the answer to that is no. And probably because I'm working with a demo catalog and I've got multiple catalogs that I work with for demo purposes, I think I'm just having a synchronization issue related to that. So here is another question. It's something that's come up in the past, and it's an important issue, I think. So if I select multiple photos, so let's just go grab a batch of photos here. Let's see some New York City photos, for example. And if I select multiple photos, so here's pictures of a little glider, and I think I did not have keywords mostly assigned to these images. One of them has a keyword. If I'm in the loop view and I decide to add a keyword, so I've selected multiple photos on the film strip, if I add a keyword right now, only this one single photo will get the keyword. So the question here is, when you select multiple photos in the film strip or on the film strip and then apply a keyword or other metadata, all of the photos do not get that information, only the active photo. It works in the grid view, but not in the film strip. Is there a way to make it work for all photos selected on the film strip? And the short answer is essentially, in the context of that specific question, no. You really essentially need to be in the grid view in order to assign metadata to multiple images. So here, for example, you can see once again that I've got, 6 photos selected on the film strip. If I go, it's probably very difficult to read, but in this field it says click here to add keywords. I click and I add keywords. I'll call this glider. I press enter, and you can see that glider was added for a keyword, but only for this image. If I switch to the next image, you'll see that it does not have the glider keyword, nor does the next one or the next one, etc. Now, conceptually, I could synchronize my metadata. So with those multiple photos selected, I could synchronize. I can turn on automatic synchronization. So I click the little light switch there, the little toggle to enable auto sync. And now if I add glider as a keyword, it does get added. Even though I'm in the loop view, I was able to add the keyword to all of those photos all automatically, even though I'm in the loop view. So why would I say no when the answer obviously is yes? And that's that I don't recommend using this option because in my mind it's too easy to forget I should say, that it's turned on rather than off. And so you would want to turn this off when you're finished so you don't accidentally make changes when you had multiple photos selected. So in my mind, when you're in the grid view, it's a little more obvious when you've selected multiple photos and now you're working with multiple photos versus in the loop view. Now you've got to keep track of, did you turn on or did you leave off or did you forget to turn off that automatic syncing option? So there is that auto sync feature. You could also sync after the fact, as in, oh, I forgot to synchronize the metadata. I forgot to have it turned on to automatic synchronization. Can I just sync after the fact? Well, you could, but now you're running this risk of not having kept track of what metadata did you update and do you want to synchronize all of those changes to metadata? And so to me, that gets a little bit tricky. And so instead, what I recommend in general is if you need to select multiple images, so let's say I'm working with one image and I want to select all of these images, I try to avoid selecting multiple photos on the film strip. And instead, I try to keep in mind, if I want to select multiple photos, switch to the grid view to make that selection so that now I've selected multiple photos, I'm working with multiple photos, and because I'm in the grid view, any changes that I make in the library module will affect those multiple photos. Another question related to, well, not another one related to hardware, but a question related to hardware is how much RAM do you recommend to run Lightroom Classic smoothly? And this is, well, actually it's sort of changing because there's, I'll say, two types of RAM. There's what we consider RAM or system memory, but then there's also video memory or video RAM. And I would say at a minimum, my recommended level essentially is 16 gigabytes of system memory. And if you can get more, why not? RAM these days is not especially expensive, so if you can up that to 24 or 32 gigabytes, that's great. But I consider 16 gigabytes to be sort of the sweet spot. But I also would suggest, if you're in the market for a new computer in particular, that you consider a computer that has a good video card with lots of memory. So I like the NVIDIA chipset myself personally, so I tend to favor cards with that chipset, and 8 gigabytes or more of video memory. Because Lightroom, along with a variety of other applications, are starting to use the video processor, the GPU, the graphics processing unit. I'm sure you've noticed over the years that Photoshop has had this ability, and Lightroom, there's an option to turn it off in case there's glitches that are caused by that. And so increasingly, software is using the graphics processor to do a lot of the work related, especially when it comes to imaging, of course. And so that is becoming increasingly important. So I would say 16 gigabytes ideally for system memory. More certainly couldn't hurt, and it might help, especially if you're running multiple applications at the same time. And then video memory, 4 gigabytes, 8 gigabytes. But basically look for a video card that's designed for gaming, and that will be a very powerful video card, generally speaking. Really good question. Something that I do try to reinforce here. So when you round trip from Photoshop back to Lightroom, do you choose Save As or just Save? And then do I have to go to import to bring it back to Lightroom? And you do not need to do any of that. So if we just go find a photo here that I'd like to send over to Photoshop for whatever reason. So I select an image and then I can choose to edit this photo. So if I go to the edit, I've got an image selected, go to the photo menu and choose Edit In, followed by Photoshop. And that will launch Photoshop if it wasn't already running, and for me it was not already running. So Photo, Edit In Photoshop, or other external editor, of course. We talked about some other external editors earlier. And then the image itself will be opened in Photoshop. You can see taking a little time to process here. And then the resulting photo will be rendered and opened inside of Photoshop. So Let's just make something completely silly here. Maybe we'll shift the colors around to something wild, and I'll add a curves adjustment, and we'll actually just make a little bit of a crazy pencil move here to create an abstract sort of weird effect for the image, just so that it stands out as being obviously changed. And then when I'm finished, I go to the File menu and do not choose Save As, because the way you can think of this essentially is Lightroom has already told Photoshop where to put this photo and what to call it. So you don't need to choose Save As. If you make a new document in Photoshop and do all sorts of work with it, if you just choose Save, it's going to bring up the Save As dialog because you never told it where to save it. It needs to ask you. But here, Lightroom has already told Photoshop where to save the image, what to call it, so you do not want to use Save As because Lightroom could get confused if you put it in the wrong place with the wrong name. Instead, just simply click the Save button. Notice I'm not being asked where I want to save it. And then, when I finish saving it, Lightroom again told Photoshop where to put it. I can close the image, and now when I get back into Lightroom, you'll see that I have that additional version. This is a TIFF image. It could be a TIFF or a Photoshop PSD file depending on the setting in Preferences, but I have there's my original here, and then my TIFF version in this case. So the original, and then the copy that was sent to Photoshop. And those layers, by the way, are still intact. So if I want to send this image back to Photoshop, I can once again go to the Photo Edit In menu. It offers to make a copy of the image. Well, I don't want a copy. I want to edit my original so that I still have my layers intact. So if I use Edit Original, now when I go back to the image and I say, oh wait, I wanted to make the zigzagging curves a little bit more dramatic, or whatever the case might be. Now I've made a change. Once again, I can just use the Save command. Obviously, you could use keyboard shortcuts for that as well. So just File Save and then File Close, and the image will be updated. So when we get back into back into Lightroom, you'll see the interpretation, the changed interpretation of the image. So then the next question here, how do I tell which is the latest version of Lightroom? And there's a couple of different ways we can go about this. I generally recommend using the Creative Cloud app for that purpose. And if we go to the Creative Cloud apps, you'll see it on the taskbar, on the bar. Now I forget the name of the bar on Windows because I've been using Macintosh so long, but the bar that where the Start menu is. And so we can see the Creative Cloud application, and there's an apps folder, and we can then go and pick and choose among the various applications. So here's Photoshop, and essentially what you're looking for, so let's see if we can, there's Lightroom Classic. What you're looking for is, what does the button say? If it says install, it means that you've not installed that application at all. That application is not on your computer. If it says open, it means the application is on your computer and you're working with the latest version. If it says update, that means that an update is available for that application, and you can click update in order to actually apply that update. And so that's a good way to make sure if you're working with multiple applications. So you can see, for example, here I have the full collection of Creative Cloud applications available to me with my subscription. If you're using the photography plan, of course, you would just have the versions of Lightroom. So here's Lightroom Classic, as well as the cloud-based Lightroom. And then we also have Photoshop in there, and Adobe Bridge would be in there somewhere as well, since I have Photoshop. So depending on which version, which subscription you're using, you might see different lists, but that is the way I would recommend making sure you're on the latest version. Funny, good question. How would you import iPhone photos, and same would go for other devices, other smartphones really, into Lightroom if they're not taken with the Lightroom mobile app, which is, of course, especially amusing to me because my photo captured on the iPhone didn't synchronize properly. But what about photos that are on your mobile device and that you're not using Lightroom Mobile? You did not use, you just used the built-in camera application, for example. So in the case of an iPhone, that means that the photos appear in the Photos app under your camera roll, and on an Android device in the Gallery app. And so how do you get those? Well, the answer is that one of two things. In theory, you could import directly into Lightroom. And so because of my hardware setup at the moment, I'm not able to plug in my iPhone to the computer, but I could actually plug in my iPhone to the computer, use the import feature, and just as I choose to import from a media card, I could also import directly from my phone. I don't recommend that because there's not an easy way to actually erase the photos on your phone as part of that workflow. Meaning that Lightroom doesn't offer you the option to erase the source media when you import photos. And the iPhone doesn't make it very easy to select all of your photos and remove them from your iPhone. You can, but it's not very easy. You can't just say select all. And so I find that it's not very easy to actually just remove the photos. So instead, what I do is use a separate tool to download the photos from my iPhone to my computer. And I use that software then to actually delete the images. And so in Adobe Bridge, for example, you can use the option to download photos. And the photo downloader in Adobe Bridge does include the option to delete the originals after they've been downloaded. I'm a Macintosh user, as you can see, and so I happen to use an application called Image Downloader. And so actually, if we switch back so I can get to the menu here, Image Capture, I should say, sorry. So there's an Image Capture app that enables me to download photos. Again, I don't have my iPhone connected, so I can't actually show that to you at the moment, but I can download the photos to my desktop, to the computer itself, and then there I can select all of the photos, and when I have a device actually connected, you would see a little circle with a slash icon, which is the delete icon. Again, in Adobe Bridge, we have that same capability. So if I launch Adobe Bridge here, for example, real quickly, then we can use that option. So we'll actually just click the camera icon here in order to download photos. Do I want to automatically? No, I do not. And so that will bring up the photo downloader where we have this delete original files checkbox available to us. So I could turn on the checkbox to delete the originals after they've been downloaded. So I could set my iPhone as the source, for example, and then download from there. But again, the point is that I use a tool to download the photos to my computer first, then erase them after I'm comfortable with that from my, in this case, iPhone. But in the process, I can also then import. So download from my phone to the computer, import from that folder to the appropriate place inside of Lightroom, and then after that's all done and I've backed up, then I could delete the photos from my source. So another question related to working on multiple computers, which is actually just essentially a variation on a theme. So the question is, I have a large Lightroom catalog on my laptop with photos that are different from the photos on my main computer. How can I move all of the photos from my laptop and then combine them with my desktop catalog? And that is a variation on a theme. It's exactly essentially the same as the traveling catalog question, because it's just that that's sort of a bigger traveling catalog. And so it's exactly the same process that I talked about before. And again, when we're importing into Lightroom from another catalog, we have the option to copy them or to move those photos. Generally, or to not move, I should say, to put them in a different location or to leave them where they are. I generally leave them where they are, meaning use the add option essentially, where we're adding them to the catalog but not moving them, and then I'll clean up the overall folder structure as a separate process. So it is certainly possible, just as you're working with a traveling catalog, or if you were to work with a traveling catalog, and you can merge those catalogs, again, with that import from another catalog command on the file menu. That's available if, maybe you decided a long time ago to listen to somebody else's advice and have a different Lightroom catalog for every calendar year, and now you've realized that's not really helping your workflow. You could choose one as the master and import from another catalog for each of those individual year catalogs to consolidate them all into one. And that, by the way, for those of you that are subscribers to my GreyLearning Ultimate Bundle, there is a course in there called Cleaning Up Your Mess in Lightroom. It's one of my more popular courses, one that I get a lot of feedback on, thanking me for helping them get their mess cleaned up. But that does cover that process in more detail of consolidating multiple catalogs and otherwise getting your workflow cleaned up. So quick question here. When I try to move files from one subfolder to another or move from a subfolder to the parent folder in Lightroom Classic, it immediately crashes and shuts down Lightroom. Is it a bug or am I doing something wrong? definitely you're not doing something wrong. Dragging and dropping from one folder to another. So if I realized that, this image belongs in a different folder, I imported it into the wrong folder, or I'm trying to consolidate folders, or whatever the case might be, I can drag and drop that photo into a different folder, and Lightroom will say, do you want to move? I'm going to cancel this in this case because I don't really want to move, but I could click the move button and the photo would actually move in Lightroom, in your catalog, and out on your external hard drive. If during that process Lightroom crashes, I would more or less call that a bug. Something is going wrong. That is not normal behavior by any stretch, because you absolutely can move photos around inside of Lightroom, and in fact, that is the only way you should move photos, is inside of Lightroom. If you're using Lightroom to manage your photos, you want to move photos, rename photos, move folders, rename folders, whatever the case might be, make sure that all of that is initiated inside of Lightroom so that Lightroom does not get confused. So a question regarding the overlap between Aurora HDR, which is my go-to tool for creating high dynamic range images, and Lightroom. So in addition to HDR merging in Aurora HDR, there's a number of editing features that seem to correspond to what you can do in Lightroom Classic. So the question is, after HDR merging in Aurora, is it better to wait to do final editing in Lightroom or to make those changes in Aurora? Now, better, that depends on your meaning. Meaning that, is there a quality benefit? And the answer is quite possibly. There's a considerable amount of overlap in terms of the general features, meaning we can adjust the exposure and we can adjust contrast and we can adjust the color. So there's a lot of overlap in terms of core features. There's also features in Aurora HDR that are not in Lightroom. My personal preference in general is that when I'm creating an HDR image, I just want a baseline image and then I'll continue working with it in Lightroom. That said, there are some features in Aurora that are pretty great and that give you some really nice capabilities. So what I would say is, if you're looking for a little more creative effect, or if you really like some of the adjustment features in Aurora, then by all means use Aurora to apply those adjustments. Just be careful not to, for example, clip highlights or shadows. In other words, to make changes that you would want to alter later in your workflow. So if you want to use those adjustments, by all means, many of them are absolutely great. My general preference is just to kind of have a baseline image. Keep in mind, of course, that for me personally, I am usually trying to create an HDR image that doesn't look like an HDR image. I want it to be somewhat tame, you might say. And so I don't generally apply strong adjustments. It's pretty straightforward. And so really, when I'm using Aurora HDR, part of the reason that I use Aurora HDR is that I find it more consistently gives me a good result in terms of how the images are actually blended together without ghosting, without, weird artifacts, etc. And so that's one of the main reasons I'm using Aurora HDR. I don't tend to use a lot of the adjustments. I'm just trying to get a good baseline image, an image that looks, you might say, just like a proper exposure, so that I can continue working in the develop module in Lightroom. That said, if you like the adjustments, and there's many adjustments that are very, very nice within Aurora HDR, certainly perfectly fine, and I would encourage even that you make some of those adjustments directly within Aurora. So this may be a little more of a tech support question, but I'll address it briefly. Why isn't Lightroom Classic recognizing an external hard drive? It used to recognize it, and suddenly it doesn't. You can see it in the computer, but not in Lightroom. So the only, other than a possible just technical glitch, what I would say is, number one, make sure that the hard drive has the same name. So on Macintosh, that's a volume label. So you can see here, mine is called My Photos. That is my hard drive, and it has the name My Photos. On Windows, this would be a drive letter. So it might be your D drive or your E drive or your F drive. If that changed, then you'll still see the hard drive here in Lightroom, but all the folders will appear to be missing. In that case, you just need to make sure that the hard drive has the same drive letter or name that Lightroom is looking for. So you could just change that, the drive letter assignment in Windows, or the volume label, which essentially is just renaming the drive on Macintosh. If there are no photos on that hard drive, or at least no photos on that drive that are actually being managed within Lightroom, then the drive won't appear at all. So if I had an additional external hard drive, if I bought a brand new external hard drive and I wanted to move some of my folders onto that external hard drive, it's not here because no photos are already being managed on that drive. what I would do in that case is make a new folder. So click on the plus button to the right of the folders label in the library module on the left panel and choose add folder. I could then add a folder, for example, I might call it photos, on that external hard drive. Now that I've added a folder on that drive, even though there's no actual photos on that drive, I would see it on my drives list underneath folders here. So by default, a hard drive won't appear unless you're managing photos. In this case, since it already was, I'm assuming that the issue is that the drive letter probably changed or there's some other technical issue going on, but I don't suspect that's the case. So here, this is a great question, and actually something that it would be great if Adobe would. This is a nice little feature ad. Hopefully not too many photographers need it, but the question is, there's over 30,000 photos that are missing in the context of Lightroom's catalog, and they're scattered across all sorts of individual folders. So there is that Find Missing Photos option. So up on the menu bar, we can go to the library. Is it on the library menu? Find all missing photos. Where is it? There it is. My eyes deceive me. So on the library menu under Find All Missing Photos, that will create a collection underneath the catalog section here. So in the catalog section, I see all photographs, I see all synced photographs. Well, if I use that command on the library menu, Find All Missing Photos, then it will create a new collection containing any of those missing photos. But then the question is, how do you filter or otherwise find missing photos in each individual folder? So if I just want to see photos that are missing in a single folder, how do I do that? And there's not really a way to do that. It would be nice, for example, to say filter based on missing status so that I could navigate among the individual folders, for example, and see only the missing photos that are in that particular location. Because otherwise you're just looking, and I don't, of course, meaning this is a demo catalog, and I haven't configured it for purposes of showing missing photos. And so there are no missing photos in this particular catalog, but normally you would see the exclamation mark icon, for example, indicating photos that are missing. All right, last question. We've gone just a little bit over, and I certainly don't want to keep you all longer. Well, I imagine many of you would love to have more answers to more of these questions. This has been so popular, I think we're actually going to have a follow-up session with more questions, and so stay tuned for that. But last question for this time, for today. Can you explain more about the differences between presets and profiles in Lightroom Classic and how to save both and where they actually get saved? So presets versus profiles. So in the develop module, I know many of you are probably aware that we've got these process versions and the adjustments for the individual colors that were in calibration, and that we now also have these profiles for the various interpretations of the image, which used to be down in that calibration section. And the idea here is that we're able to match more or less what we would have seen in the camera. So with your camera, you can choose from various photo modes, you might say. So I could choose landscape, or I could choose portrait, and you'll see that the basic interpretation of the photo changes. And that's more or less intended to give you the ability to mimic those in-camera adjustments on some level. At least that's kind of the original intent, you might say. And so we can browse among those, but there's also a variety now of additional interpretations. And so we have artistic interpretations and black and white interpretations, which are profiles. And so the key question here is, how does that differ from the presets that you're able to create? And essentially, the profiles are baseline underlying interpretations of the photo itself that you could say you don't really have any control over that initial interpretation, meaning you apply it and it's done. The key difference between that and a profile, and a preset. So a profile is found on our pop-up over here in the basics section of the develop module. Presets are found over on the left panel. Presets save settings from the right panel. So if I choose the sepia tone option, for example, that's certainly giving me a starting point for the image as a sepia tone, but what it really did is set specific values. Whatever was saved as part of my original preset, that represents saved settings from the right panel in the develop module. So in split toning, for example, you can see there's my sepia tone color that was used to create this color effect. It's with a vignette, so if we go into our effects section, you'll see that a vignette has been applied. So the preset simply represents saved settings over on the right. If I then, let's go find, here's warm desaturation. So if we watch the vignette settings as I click on that preset, that didn't change because it didn't include the vignetting. Let's find the example. Well, I guess the color would be the most obvious. So here's a color and clarity boost versus sepia tone. So I can switch back and forth between, and let's go see if I go into the basics section, and we'll pay attention especially to vibrance and saturation. For the sepia tone, because it's black and white, we don't even have vibrance and saturation adjustments available, whereas with this color and clarity boost, we do, and so those values are changed. So here, for example, warm desaturation, the vibrance goes to a negative value, color and clarity boost, it goes to a positive value. So the presets are simply saved adjustment settings from over on the right panel, whereas these profiles are essentially underlying interpretations, base level interpretations of the actual photo. It is not adjusting any of your settings down below, it's just giving you a different overall starting point. So hopefully that all makes sense. Hopefully today's questions and the answers are very helpful and interesting and informative for all of you. I very much appreciate you joining me today. I can tell by the number of questions that we got in advance as well as live during today's webinar presentation that we're going to have to do this again, probably very soon. So stay tuned for another presentation, another question and answer session related to Lightroom Classic, as well as other topics that we will present on as part of the GreyLearning webinar series. Once again, thank you to Tamron USA for sponsoring this series, and thank you to all of you for joining me. It's been a lot of fun, and I hope you've enjoyed it and found it very helpful. We'll see you again on a future webinar presentation. In the meantime, thanks very much.